I still remember the exact moment Daniel asked me to go with him. It wasn't dramatic or planned. We were sitting in a small coffee shop near my apartment, the kind of place where no one rushes you out and the windows are always fogged up, even on clear days. He stirred his coffee slowly, then looked up and said, almost casually, I'm thinking of taking a short mountain trip this weekend, just to breathe. You want to come? At first, I laughed it off. A mountain trip sounded nice, but my life wasn't exactly simple at that time. I was in a relationship, on paper at least. Ryan and I had been together for almost 3 years. From the outside, we looked stable. Same apartment, same routine, same shared jokes. But inside, something had gone quiet. Conversations had turned into updates, affection into habit. We lived together, yet I often felt alone. Daniel knew all of this, at least parts of it. We had met a year earlier through mutual friends, and somehow he had become the person I talked to when I didn't know how to explain my feelings to anyone else. He was calm in a way that made people open up. He listened without interrupting, without trying to fix things. That made him dangerous in a way I didn't fully understand yet. I don't know, I said, staring at my cup. Ryan might not like it. Daniel shrugged gently. It's just a trip. Fresh air. No noise. You've been saying you're tired. He was right. I was tired, not physically, but emotionally. Tired of pretending everything was fine. Tired of pushing down thoughts that came up late at night when Ryan was asleep beside me, facing the other direction. Still, guilt settled in my chest immediately. Even considering the trip felt like a small betrayal. That night, I brought it up with Ryan. I tried to sound casual, like it didn't matter either way. He barely looked up from his phone. Yeah, sure, he said. Have fun. Just text me when you get there. There was no jealousy in his voice. No curiosity. That hurt more than I expected. The next 2 days passed slowly. I packed and unpacked my bag twice, unsure why I was so nervous. It wasn't like I was doing anything wrong, I told myself. Friends go on trips together all the time. Still, a quiet voice inside me kept asking why this felt different. Early Saturday morning, Daniel picked me up. The city faded behind us as the road narrowed and the buildings turned into trees. Music played softly, then stopped. We didn't rush to fill the silence. It felt natural, like we didn't need noise to justify our presence. As the mountains rose around us, something in my chest loosened. The air felt cleaner, sharper. Daniel smiled more out there, like the space gave him permission to breathe. We talked about small things at first, work, random memories, places we wanted to see someday. Nothing heavy, nothing risky. But even then, I noticed how easy it was to be myself around him. I didn't have to perform or explain. I didn't feel like I was asking for too much just by being present. That realization scared me. When we finally arrived at the cabin, the world felt very far away. No neighbors, no traffic, no constant buzzing of phones. Just trees, mountains, and a silence that felt honest. Daniel unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting me go in first. It was a small gesture, but it stayed with me. As I stood there, looking out of the mountains through the wide window, a thought crossed my mind when I tried hard to push away. This trip wasn't just about rest. It was about something I'd been avoiding for a long time. The truth about what I was missing and who I was becoming, I didn't know it yet. But agreeing to that trip had already changed something inside me. The first night in the mountains felt unreal, like we had stepped outside of time. After unloading the car, we made a simple dinner together, moving around the small kitchen without getting in each other's way. Outside, the sky slowly darkened, and the mountains turned into quiet shadows. There was no signal on our phones, and, for once, that didn't make me anxious. It felt like permission to disappear for a while. We ate at the small wooden table near the window. The cabin lights were soft, almost warm, and the silence between us didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt earned. Daniel talked about his childhood, about growing up in different places, and never really staying long enough to feel rooted. I found myself listening closely, not just to his words, but to the pauses between them. I think that's why I like places like this, he said, gesturing toward the dark outline of the trees outside. They don't ask anything from you. That line stayed with me. Back home, everything asked something from me. My job, my relationship, even my friends. Expectations were everywhere, pressing down quietly. Here, there was nothing to prove. Later, we stepped outside with mugs of hot tea. The air was cold and sharp, and the stars looked unreal, scattered across the sky in a way I'd never seen from the city. We stood side by side, looking up, not talking much. I felt small in a good way, like my problems didn't own the entire universe. That night, I lay awake longer than I expected. The cabin creaked softly, settling into the cold. My thoughts kept drifting back to Ryan. I wondered what he was doing, whether he missed me at all. Then I felt guilty for wondering that while lying a few feet away from someone else who made me feel strangely calm. I turned onto my side and stared into the dark, aware of a quiet tension growing inside me. The next morning, we woke early. Sunlight poured through the window, lighting up the room in soft gold. Daniel was already up, standing outside on the porch, breathing in the air like he'd been waiting for this moment his whole life. We ate breakfast quickly and decided to go for a hike before the trails got busy. The path was narrow and uneven, winding through tall trees and over small streams. As we walked, our conversation slowly deepened. Without the distractions of daily life, there was nowhere to hide. I told him things I hadn't said out loud before, about feeling invisible in my own relationship, about how I sometimes wondered if staying felt easier than being honest. Daniel listened quietly, not judging, not interrupting. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "That's a heavy thing to carry alone," he said. His words hit harder than I expected. I realized then how rarely anyone had acknowledged my feelings without trying to explain them away. We stopped walking for a moment, standing on a ridge overlooking the valley below. The view was wide and open, and something about it made honesty feel unavoidable. That I didn't say anything else, but I didn't need to. The silence between us held more meaning than words. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen, not as someone's partner, not as a role I was supposed to play, but as myself. That realization scared me. I knew I was crossing into dangerous territory, even if nothing physical had happened. Emotionally, I was leaning somewhere I shouldn't. I thought of Ryan again and felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want to be the kind of person who betrays trust. Even quietly, on a hike back, Daniel walked a little ahead of me. I watched him move through the trees, steady and unhurried. I wondered if he felt the same shift I did, or if this was something happening only inside me. Part of me wanted to ask, to bring it into the open. Another part was afraid of what the answer might change. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, I realized something important. This trip wasn't just about escape. It was showing me the gap between who I was pretending to be and who I actually was. And once you see a gap like that, you can't unsee it. That I didn't know what I would do with that truth yet. I only knew that when I eventually went back home, nothing would feel exactly the same again. The next few minutes passed in a strange, suspended calm, as if the night itself had slowed down. Standing there beside Alex, I became more aware of my own thoughts than of the party behind us. The laughter drifting through the open door felt distant, almost unreal, like it belonged to a different version of me, one who wasn't quietly questioning his own heart. We eventually went back inside, the music wrapping around us again. My friends glanced our way with curious smiles, the kind that made me feel seen and slightly exposed. I brushed it off, telling myself I was reading too much into things. Still, I noticed how naturally Alex stayed near me, how conversation flowed without effort. There was no pressure, no performance. Just an ease I hadn't realized I'd been missing. We talked about childhood memories, about learning who we were in places that didn't always make space for people like us. He spoke about moving to the city to finally breathe, to finally live honestly. I shared pieces of my own story, the fear, the relief, the long process of becoming comfortable in my own skin. Every word felt understood before it was even finished. At some point, my phone vibrated again. A message from Daniel. "Hope you're having fun. Miss you." I smiled at the screen, but the warmth didn't last as long as it should have. I typed back quickly, telling him I wished he were there. It was true, and yet, standing there with someone else listening so closely, I felt a confusing mix of comfort and conflict. Alex noticed my distraction, but didn't ask. Instead, he waited, giving me space in a way that felt respectful. That made it harder, not easier. It reminded me of how rare it is to reminds me of how rare it is to feel truly heard. The night moved forward in fragments, shared laughter, quiet pauses, the soft rhythm of music. I caught myself looking for Alex in the room without meaning to. Each time our eyes met, there was a silent acknowledgement, nothing dramatic, just an unspoken connection that I told myself it was harmless. Friends talk. People connect. That's all this was. But somewhere between the conversations and the glances, an invisible line began to blur. I started sharing thoughts I usually kept guarded. Fears about the future, about growing distant from someone you love without knowing how to stop it. Alex listened, not offering solutions, just understanding. That alone felt dangerously comforting that I in the back of my mind. A quiet voice warned me to step away, to rejoin my friends, to put space between this moment and whatever it might become. I tried. I really did. But emotional gravity has a way of pulling you back before you realize you've stopped resisting. Later, as people began to leave and the house slowly emptied, the energy shifted. The party softened into something quieter, more reflective. Alex and I found ourselves sitting on opposite ends of the couch, not close enough to touch, yet closer than necessary. "I'm glad I met you tonight," he said, his voice low but sincere. I swallowed, feeling the weight of those words more than I should have. "Me too," I replied, before thinking about what it meant. That it wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. But it felt like the opening of a door I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through. When it was time to go, we stood by the door, the moments stretching out between us. There was no dramatic goodbye, just a pause, a shared look, and the exchange of numbers. Simple, almost innocent. As I stepped out into the night, the cool air hit my face, clearing my head just enough for guilt to settle in. I hadn't done anything wrong. Not technically, but something inside me knew that emotional lines can be just as powerful as physical ones. Walking home, I replayed the night over and over, trying to convince myself it was just a pleasant coincidence. Still, deep down, I sensed that this connection, however quiet, had already changed something. The days after the party felt heavier than I expected. On the surface, nothing had changed. My routine stayed the same: work, home, messages with friends, but inside my thoughts kept drifting back to that night. Not to anything dramatic, but to the feeling of being understood without having to explain myself. Alex didn't text right away, and part of me was relieved. The silence gave me space to breathe, to tell myself that the moment had passed and life was returning to normal. I focused on Daniel, on being present when we talked, on reminding myself why I loved him. Yet even as I tried, there was an awareness I couldn't ignore, a small emotional distance that felt larger seeing it from the outside. When Alex's name finally appeared on my phone, it caught me off guard. The message was simple, almost careful. He said he'd enjoyed talking and hoped I was doing well. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, weighing every possible response. Ignoring it felt dishonest. Replying felt risky. Eventually, I chose the safest words I could find. What followed was nothing intense, nothing secretive, just occasional conversations that slipped easily into my days. We talked about work stress, favorite songs, the strange comfort of late-night city lights. I kept telling myself there was no harm in this. But emotional closeness has a quiet way of growing. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles in. With Daniel, the contrast became more noticeable. Our conversations felt functional. Updates, plans, responsibilities. When I mentioned feeling overwhelmed or disconnected, he listened, but his attention was divided, his responses shorter than they used to be. I knew he cared. I also knew he was tired. So as I got out late one night, I sat alone on the couch, phone in my hand, scrolling through messages without really reading them. Alex had asked how I was doing, really doing. I hesitated, then answered honestly. I admitted I felt confused, restless, unsure of why something that should have been enough suddenly felt incomplete. The moment I sent it, a wave of guilt washed over me. I had crossed a line, Not by saying anything inappropriate, but by sharing something intimate with someone who wasn't my partner. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. That almost made it worse. Alex didn't take advantage of it. He didn't push or suggest anything. He simply listened. And that, somehow, made the emotional weight even heavier. I began noticing the little things. The way I looked at my phone hoping to see his name, the way I paused before telling Daniel about my day, choosing what to share and what to keep to myself. Those pauses were new, and they scared me. One evening, Daniel and I sat across from each other at dinner, the room quiet except for the sound of utensils. He asked if something was wrong. The question caught me off guard because I hadn't realized how visible my distance had become. I wanted to say everything. I wanted to be honest. But fear held me back. The fear of hurting him, of breaking something we'd built, of admitting that I didn't fully understand my own feelings. I said I was just tired. The lies sat between us, small but heavy. That night, as I lay awake, I realized something painful but important. Betrayal doesn't always look like secrets and dramatic choices. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it's choosing comfort over courage and connection over honesty. That I hadn't touched anyone. I hadn't made promises. Yet I knew, deep down, that something had shifted. I was standing in a gray space, one that required a decision sooner or later. And the longer I waited, the harder that decision would become. The weight of everything I'd been carrying finally became impossible to ignore. It showed up in small ways at first. Restless sleep, unfinished thoughts, a constant sense that I was failing someone even when I couldn't name how. Every time Daniel smiled at me, that weight pressed a little harder and I started pulling back without meaning to. I answered messages slower, avoided long conversations, filled silence with distractions. Daniel noticed. Of course he did. He always had been perceptive, even when he was exhausted. One evening, after another quiet dinner, he set his fork down and looked at me carefully. There was no anger in his eyes, just concern. "Talk to me," he said softly. "You've been somewhere else for a while now." The honesty in his voice broke something open inside me. I realized then that avoiding the truth hadn't protected him. It had only delayed the hurt. I took a deep breath, feeling my heart race, and decided to stop running from what I already knew had happened. I told him about the party. Not every detail, but enough to be honest. I told him I'd met someone, that nothing physical had happened, but that I'd let myself open up emotionally in a way I shouldn't have. I admitted the confusion, the guilt, the way I'd felt unseen before and ashamed afterward. Daniel listened without interrupting. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was pain beneath it. "So you didn't cheat," he said slowly. "But you were halfway there." I nodded, tears blurring my vision. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," he replied, "but intention doesn't erase impact." Those words stayed with me. That we talked for hours that night, about how distance had grown between us without either of us fully acknowledging it, about how stress and routine had replaced the closeness we once had. He admitted he'd been distracted, emotionally unavailable in ways he hadn't meant to be. I admitted I'd been lonely without knowing how to say it out loud. There were moments when it felt like we might find our way back to each other right there, sitting on that couch, laying everything bare. And there were moments when the gap between us felt too wide to cross. What hurt the most was realizing that neither of us was the villain. There was no dramatic betrayal, no clear line where love turned into something else. Just two people slowly drifting, and one moment that forced us to see the end of the conversation. Daniel asked for space. Not as a punishment, but as a necessity. He needed time to process, to decide what trust looked like after something like this. I respected that, even though it hurt. The next day, I texted Alex. I told him I needed to step back, that I was sorting through things in my relationship and didn't want to continue something that wasn't fair to anyone involved. His response was kind and understanding. He wished me clarity and happiness, nothing more. That message felt like closure. Alone in the quiet of my apartment, I reflected on how easily emotional lines can blur when needs go unspoken. I understood then that love doesn't disappear all at once. It fades into spaces where communication should be. And whether or not Daniel and I could repair what had been shaken, I knew one thing for certain. Facing the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, is the only way forward. Time moved differently after that conversation. The days felt slower, quieter, as if the world had lowered its volume to give me room to think. Without Daniel's constant presence, I became more aware of my own thoughts, my own patterns, and the ways I had avoided difficult conversations before they turned into difficult consequences. That I spent a lot of time reflecting on that night, the party that was meant to celebrate me. It wasn't the music or the laughter that stayed with me anymore. It was the realization that I had been carrying unmet needs without naming them, hoping they would resolve themselves. They never do. Daniel and I eventually met again, not to argue, but to talk with the kind of honesty we hadn't practiced in a long time. There were no raised voices, no accusations. Just two people acknowledging what had been lost and what still remained. We talked about boundaries, about emotional intimacy, about how easily connection can drift when you assume love is strong enough to survive neglect, that we didn't rush a decision. Some relationships end in clear moments. Others pause, reshaping themselves into something different. Whether that meant healing together or learning to let go with respect, we agreed on one thing. We owed each other truth, even when it was uncomfortable. That I learned that infidelity isn't always about actions everyone can see. Sometimes it lives quietly in unspoken feelings, in conversations you avoid having with the person who deserves them most. That doesn't make it harmless. It just makes it easier to justify until the damage is already done. As for Alex, I carried no resentment, only gratitude for the mirror he unknowingly held up to my life. Meeting him didn't ruin my relationship. It revealed the cracks that were already there. That distinction mattered. In the weeks that followed, I became more intentional with my words, my presence, my emotions. I checked in with myself before seeking comfort elsewhere. I spoke up sooner. I listened more closely. I stopped assuming that love would read my mind. If there's one thing that night taught me, it's this. Feeling seen is powerful, but staying loyal to someone else or to yourself requires courage. Courage to speak when silence feels easier. Courage to choose honesty over temporary comfort. That I don't regret the party. I don't regret the lesson. I carry it forward as a reminder that love isn't maintained by grand gestures, but by everyday attention. And sometimes, the most important invitation you receive isn't to a party at all, but to finally face the truth about what your heart needs.